meaning this will override that one. Okay.
Does this work? There we go. Excellent. Yeah, good evening. Thank you for being here. We are really interested in rebuilding what I think of as kind of the extracurricular intellectual project of the college post-COVID. And this is the lecture is one thing that has way more value when you get like me and you look and you think, wow, I have a chance to see Oyler Wu lecture way back then in school, and look what they've gone on to do in changing the field. It seems like one more thing in a busy schedule. It's great that you're here. We're going to build momentum about these things, because I think there's exchange that happens in these type of events that I want to be a huge advocate for that type of vivid educational experience. So I appreciate all of you taking time to make it happen. Since young, by the way, for those who don't know me, to be. No, that sounds fine. Okay. Thank you. 2013, the Charles L. Barber Endowment has generously enabled the College of Architecture and Design to promote design excellence by bringing nationally and internationally recognized architects to serve as the BarberMcMurry Professor in Design. The professorship is the result of a $1 million endowment given by Blanche Barber and the fine folks over at BarberMcMurry Architects. BarberMcMurry Architects is a Knoxville-based architecture and design firm, recently celebrated its 100th year. And previous BarberMcMurry professors have included a really impressive list: Larry Scarpa of Brooks Scarpa, Wendell Burnett of Wendell Burnett Architects, Billy Faircloth of Kieran Timberlake, and last spring, Mitchell Squire. So the support of BarberMcMurry Architects is essential to the very thing that I just congratulated you for participating in, which is our attempt at the college and at the school level to make our student experience as vivid as possible. So really, without that sort of support from alums and partners, and in this case, both alum and partner, and in-town people who are part of the design culture, the way BarberMcMurry Architects is, it's just we would have less things to celebrate like this. So thank you to the folks from BarberMcMurry that are here, Michael in the front row, and Chad and Heather up there. Yeah, we really appreciate your support. And because of that support, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the 2021 BarberMcMurry Endowed Professors in Design, Jenny Wu and Dwayne Oyler of Oyler Wu Collaborative in Los Angeles. So first, Jenny. Jenny received her Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University and a Master of Architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. She's a member, full-time or consistent member of the design faculty at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, SCI-Arc in LA, and teaches in an itinerant fashion all around, and thus her teaching here with us. Jenny, in addition to founding the Oyler Wu Collaborative, Jenny founded Lace by Jenny Wu, a line of 3D printed jewelry, in 2014. The pieces have been featured in publications such as Forbes, People, and Elle magazine. Jenny's been named one of 4 design visionaries by Porsche and Dwell magazine in their Powered by Design documentary, showcasing her pioneering work in 3D printing. And that scale of jewelry production is really something that feeds in, and I think we'll see that tonight, feeds into the work that she does in collaboration with Dwayne as a more formal part of the office. Now, Dwayne Oyler has taught architecture studios at Syracuse University, a research institute for experimental architecture in the Cooper Union. He's currently a full-time or consistent member of the SciArc design faculty and teaches in other places in a fashion like we have them here as a visitor. Dwayne received his Bachelor of Architecture from Kansas State University and a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Prior to establishing the Oyler Wu Collaborative with Jenny, Dwayne worked for Toshika Mori, collaborated extensively with Labius Woods on numerous projects, including 9 Boxes, Terrain, and Sightline Vienna. And that foundational work with Labius Woods, I think, is for those of you who know the connection there, is like you can really see that saliently in the work that these guys are doing. The Oyler Wu Collaborative together was established in 2004 and is located, as I said, in Los Angeles, California. Recent work encompasses a variety of scales from product design and installation to residential and institutional buildings. I mean, this is really a case of, moving from jewelry to urban infrastructure as a practice, and I think that's super exciting. The office has won numerous awards. The 2013 Design Vanguard Award from Architectural Record, the 2013 Emerging Talent Award from AIA California, the 2012 Presidential Honor Award for Emerging Practice from AIA Los Angeles, Taiwan's ADA Award for Emerging Architect, and the 2011 Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League in New York. They're also currently finalists, one of 4 finalists in the Cold War Memorial Competition, which they will not show today, I understand from being with them earlier, because they cannot share that, but it sounds like an exciting project. Their work has been published globally and is widely recognized for its excellence in architectural design, research, and fabrication. There are 2 books featuring their work. Pendulum Plane, published by the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design in 2009, and Trilogy, SciArc Pavilions, published by SciArc Press in 2014, that chronicles that particular project. So as part of their relationship with our college, they're making multiple visits here. They're working with students in our 5th year undergraduate program, as well as some students from our graduate program, in a vertically integrated advanced architectural studio. It's an option studio. The students, based on the generosity of the BMA professorship, were able to go to Los Angeles recently on a field trip to both visit the office, see the work firsthand and the working conditions, and see the sites in LA, as well as have a review there with design professionals and teachers in the Los Angeles area. So it's a little bit more, gives you more of a sense of what it means for us to have this opportunity. Their studio is assisted by Tucker Van Leeuwen Hall, who's an affiliate of their practice and who's working with the students. And so they're working both virtually with our students when they're not here, and then intensely in person when they're here. So tonight's talk, Inlays, Loose Fits, and Other Puzzling Forms of Assembly, will give us some background context to the work that they're doing with students, but more importantly, will show that range of work and just the process by which they're using. So couldn't be more happy to have these guys here. So join me in welcoming Dwayne and Jenny.
Our hope is that the student work reflects that excitement. We had the students set up their work out in the atrium, so if you get a chance afterwards, stop by and check it out. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about who we are and how we work. Let me get situated here. At our core, we're obsessive designers and makers. We make things. We make things. Drawings, models, fabrications, strange objects. And most importantly, at least to us, we make buildings. We believe that life is elevated by those things that surround us. And we believe that our contribution as architects and designers is to provide a sense of wonder, a sense of curiosity, and an intellectual engagement through those things. And the work that we do, as Jason mentioned, varies really radically in scale. From towers to tables, from pavilions to pods, from the infrastructural to the intimate, and from tree houses to tricycles. We believe that with every way of working comes a different set of criteria that's at play, be it the spatial and structural aspects of a physical model, the precision and optimization possible through digital work, the materiality possible in a prototype, and the instantaneous ability of a hand sketch to convey intuitive ideas really quickly. We hope to be seen as an office that exists between the many camps that are often built around any one of those categories. We draw every day, and it remains for us the most effective form of communication. And while we still draw in these types of conventional ways, the way that we draw has been expanding. There we go. It's been expanding. And it's been especially useful to draw in other ways as a way to overcome language barriers and to speak to a wider audience that sometimes understands the work through a different lens. These animations were largely used as a replacement for having to draw elaborate two-dimensional sets. The one on the left being a project of ours in Columbus, Indiana, and the one on the right being the only drawings that were produced for a crew that assembled the piece in Taipei. Model making remains a central part of the way we develop the work. And this is especially true with regard to the intangible effects of light on a surface, or the material qualities that are so difficult to replicate quickly in digital form. At the core of our practice has been the belief that operating in the physical world is where we have the greatest impact, despite the fact that we draw every day. And we've essentially tried to put pressure we've tried to use this love of making as a way to put things out there and to test them against the pressures of the real world. We started out making these projects out of necessity, and there was a feeling that we would someday grow out of them. We were simply building them because we had to, and we didn't have clients to pay for them. We simply said, we'll learn the skills necessary to make them happen. And we no longer build projects of this scale ourselves, but we're still insistent on making things. And that really is because few things are as rewarding to us as moving a project from concept to built work on your own. The material qualities, the tendencies and resistance of the material, and frankly the struggle of the real world development, it brings something that's really essential to that sense of reward. We're an office that, quite frankly, loves what we do. We've used every minute of the last 15 to 20 years shaping our lives around design and making. And the culture of our office is very much a family that shares that ethos. If you've been to our office, we live and we work in the same space. And our own kids and their toys are a part of that experience. Those are two different sons, by the way. Another important part of the office is the seamless integration of Lace by Jenny Wu. What began as really a personal experiment for Jenny, it grew into a jewelry company that produces and sells what I think are some of the most stunning pieces of jewelry on planet Earth. The brand combines cutting-edge technologies like advanced printing technologies and robotics, as well as things like technologies like lab-grown diamonds, with an elegant aesthetic sensibility. An interesting thing's been happening with our work over the last 3 to 5 years. They've essentially been finding second lives for various reasons. A couple of them we'll touch on tonight. A few years ago, we built a project for a 3D printing food company called 3DS Culinary in Hollywood. They have moved out of that space, and the new tenant needs to open it up to make a large gallery. And we were asked if we had any ideas about how to use the primary elements of the scheme. And we immediately thought about our own office space, went over to the space, and took the pieces out. It took a fair amount of adaptation to make them work in our space. Essentially, we had to rebuild about half of the scheme. And in order to do that, we used a technology called Fologram, which is essentially an augmented reality software that couples with Microsoft HoloLenses in order to produce, in order to overlay a 3D model over a real-world environment. So, and this is just an example of the way there's a kind of merging of the things we're building and making with the kind of drawings that are somewhere between animation and drawing in space. So I want to show a video here. And in the video, you'll see moments of this HoloLens technology. Fascinating technology. Prior to this, we hadn't been very interested in any form of augmented reality. But because this mixes all of these interests so seamlessly, we think it's a wonderful way to work. You'll notice in the scheme Jenny and I have talked about the work in terms of 3 overarching categories: line, surface, and volume. What's perhaps been most interesting about those ideas has been both the evolution that led to them, as well as their relationship to one another. And in order to talk about that evolution, it's important that I touch on each one, but I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. Many of the first projects involved a series of studies that were made up almost entirely of line work, and they toggled between drawings, models, and fabrications, mostly installations. They grew out of a common interest of Jenny and I's, and of these kind of deep spatial ideas built up out of lines. And rather than looking at them as something that was meant to be achieved as a pure aesthetic endeavor, the idea was to sort of look at them and ask if there were qualities that we were able to mine in order to make a range of projects, meaning even if things didn't necessarily look like this, what kind of ideas could be pulled from them. So they looked at issues like perception, ideas of foreground and background, and the idea that you could toggle between those two things in instantaneous ways, something that's inherent to line and doesn't exist in other formal shapes. The drawings were hyper-complex, and they were often unrestrained in their formal and organizational systems. And they strove for a deep sense of spatial complexity. And as they were translated to projects, other factors came to bear on the work, namely the question of making and materiality. So we built nearly all of these projects that you'll see over the next few slides entirely by ourselves, many of them in the scorching back corner of the Cyark parking lot. The material, its behavior, and especially its limitations led to a formal sensibility that remains in so much of the work today. If I could point to one single factor that's led to the formal and aesthetic sensibility that influences the work today, it would probably be the regulated curvatures that came with those early projects, essentially the result of using these sort of bending tools and understanding the limits of the material. But the projects also allowed us to deal with these kind of perceptual ideas, ways of thinking about the body's relationship to the work, and the integration of scale and sort of furniture-like elements, and the deep spatial densities that were seen in the drawings. The introduction of surface forced us to think about how to simultaneously highlight ideas of linearity in structural systems while creating surfaces and panelization. With these projects, you'll notice a loose-fit relationship between the two systems. At times, the two are in sync with one another, with lines creating folds in the surface, and at other times, the two systems are independent, yet complementary. As this idea translates to building strategies, you really begin to see those things working in tandem with one another. This one is a renovation that was unbuilt in Los Angeles, but remains an idea from a tectonic standpoint that we continue to work on. This one is a current project, the Kaohsiung Museum of Fine Arts, that's in the construction document phase. Our volumetric studies started with a set of experiments that we call active inlays. So just to kind of break down where this came from, this started with the idea of inlay, and we were sort of mining the term inlay for its ambiguities. When someone says the word inlay, what's generally thought of is a relatively thin surface that's laid into another in order to produce a coplanar surface. But the definition doesn't necessarily rule out the idea that the inlaid element isn't deep and three-dimensional. So these studies exploit that ambiguity. At times they suggest a conventional inlay. You see flat surface that's coplanar, two-dimensional and located only at the surface. But at other times, their loose-fit relationships allow the object to reveal this deep three-dimensional object. They raise questions about their formal continuities as eccentric elements seem to pass through the larger object. And like the drawings, we're kind of looking to these, trying to understand repetitive characteristics that we look to deeper. And a lot of this is really coming out of this idea that the very act of making often sets in motion intuitive ideas that have to be mined for exactly what it is you're looking at. So this idea that you sort of post-rationalize or came up with an idea after you made the thing, in our mind is a productive way of working, because it's essentially saying, what do I do, often intuitively, and how do I think about that in more intelligent ways so that it begins to drive the work in ways that I can talk about, that I can interrogate, that I can have discussions with other people about. The surface manipulations are the product of the eccentric object, sort of finding its resting place. It moves between that tight fit. You'll see moments where it's perfectly nestled into the object. You'll see moments where it pulls away. But there's always some sort of tension between the two, as though the eccentric object within the larger object has been in some form of dialogue. And in this larger assembly of active inlays, you now see a handful of wireframe objects that reveal that ambiguity. In the top block, here with the two pieces, you, for example, see, well, in the one on the far left, what you see is the suggestion that the pieces in the lower end have continuity with the pieces in the upper corner. But when you look at the wireframe, what it actually reveals is that there are moments of continuity and there are moments that aren't continuous. In this example of furniture, this kind of idea produces elements that at times seem to produce volumetric pieces. You see the block, for example, in the lower left, and at other times extend to reveal only a thin surface, like the surface of the legs in the upper right. So why does this matter architecturally? Well, as we move to buildings, this strategy sets up a certain kind of expectation about the relationship between parts, both formally and spatially. We can produce a sense of curiosity about the two-dimensionality of a facade, for example, by revealing certain three-dimensional curiosities. How deep is it? What does it link to? Is it connected to this? Is it related to that thing around the corner? In our mind, this tension that is set up between two objects is especially productive. In this case, which is for an office building in LA, the space is linked three-dimensionally to an interior lobby. But one of the points we want to make here is that tension produced by the suggestion of continuity is often as powerful as true continuity, and becomes a really fruitful tool for thinking about the design of architectural effects even when continuity isn't possible, and often it isn't. One of the issues that's resonated through all of the work has been a really intense interest in the relationship of parts. While this has been apparent in the relationship of the line to surface to volume, our most recent studies look closely at a set of volumetric relationships that are based on puzzle-like qualities. We wanted to show a few of these puzzles that we've been making in the office to help demonstrate the kind of qualities that we find especially interesting. So puzzles are intentionally designed to delay your full understanding. They require cognitive engagement with their nuanced characteristics. In other words, they have to be studied closely in order to be understood, often revealing concealed or hidden relationships that are deep inside the interior. It sounds a lot like architecture, doesn't it? This geometry is central to their function as well as to their aesthetic, and that geometry is often propagated throughout the system in order to mask their true assembly, effectively conflating geometric patterning with assembly systems. Each of our studies looks differently at assembly. The previous slide looking at various forms of rotational assembly, this one on simple slides that require sequential movements. This spiral system pulls from a number of principles found in the active inlays, slicing and revealing just enough to provoke a sense of curiosity about the inner workings and hints of the system at play. With many of the puzzles, the reveals and the negatives also suggest other possible forms of assembly. These negatives form a kind of tension between parts, a near fit that sometimes delivers and at other times only sets in motion pressure for further investigation. Like the active inlays, we find the translation to architectural ideas rich in possibility, particularly in terms of the perceptual understanding of architectural parts. While it might not be so unusual to discuss the assembly of a set of architectural details, one rarely discusses program as a complex three-dimensional assembly, emphasis on the word assembly. Also, rarely does one use the term assembly to describe the relationship of a building to a site. You rarely hear an architect say, I assembled the building into a site. But we believe that this is an interesting way to think about these kinds of relationships, as puzzles inherently set up a greater sense of three-dimensional overlap and interlock, effectively a different form of site specificity. Our interest in this is relatively new, and they're just beginning to find their way into larger projects. But one project that we've just completed was for a client that came to us with the idea of creating a set of Jack and Jill children's chairs. He's effectively a collector who commissions people to create Jack and Jill chairs for him. So we saw this, obviously, as a great opportunity to build on this idea of puzzling. Because he's a collector, it was pretty clear that these are not going to be sat in most of the time. Most of the time, they will be on display. And so the idea was effectively that we create something that most of the time is simply displayed as this kind of curious object that on one hand doesn't hide anything. Both chairs, every part of every chair, both chairs, clearly there. But the idea is that it masks that identity until they are taken apart. So these also examples of the kind of smaller things that we're still fabricating within our own shop. These made out of cherry and stainless steel. These are from 2 days ago. We literally finished 2 days ago. And a few of the details. Here you start to see some of the carryover from some of the interests in the active inlays that also are especially helpful in thinking about the puzzles. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Denny.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this working? Are we good? Okay. So I'm going to talk about a few projects from start to finish. I think Dwayne gave a really great overview of, you know, our interests and our trajectory as an office. The first project I want to talk about is the project for Exhibit Columbus, and this is in Columbus, Indiana. I think probably most of you might know about Columbus, Indiana, but we were asked several years ago to be part of this community. It's a small town of 40,000 people, but it has something like 70 noteworthy buildings and like 4 Pritzker Prize design buildings. So we felt like this was such a great place to really work on something that starts to resonate with what was there. So our site was next to an aerial Saarinen bank, and as you know, there were 3 Saarinen projects in Columbus. And the site was, the bank is those 3, the 9 circles, that was the site, this sort of roof condition, and then there was a sort of plaza area, and curiously, there were these 3 kind of drive-through tellers. And so instead of putting it in the more obvious place, which was the grassy area on the very left side, we actually thought, what if we use the drive-through tellers as a way to kind of get more architecture out of it? So, and then, anyone trying to build something next to such a master building is truly scary, and also, you try to think about not, how do you work on that problem? You don't want to be copying, but you want to understand some of the things that might be helpful in the way you think about the project. So we just love a lot of the ways that formally he was able to defy the understanding of structure. For example, if you look at the Dulles Airport, the moment where the column meets the roof, where you can imagine the load transfer happens, that's where it actually disappears. It kind of goes up and gets hung, and then you see this kind of glow of light. So there's a very curious way of delaying that expectation of what you want to see. There's also, inside the bank, these kind of half-circular roof and ceiling, and then that's where the kind of glow of light. The same thing he does in the Miller House, where you see where the columns meet the ceiling. Again, it disappears. It gets kind of this framework, and then a glow of light comes through. And we found those kind of those moments of kind of delay perception really, really amazing. We also looked at some of his work where he's also working on, while he has working on larger formal development, there's also these kind of lighter, more filigree tectonic elements in his project. So just a kind of a small animation that shows, so these 3 canopies are the existing, people used to sit there and give out money. And then now it's just 3 canopies. So we created 2 L-shaped walls, essentially, that frames the canopies. One is this kind of frame-like filigree wall with these solid objects inlaid into them. And the other one is a solid wall with a more kind of filigree line-based objects in it. Some plans. And this was one of the projects where we completely built in Los Angeles. There were things that we knew how to do. We knew how to build a lot of the framework from our earlier installations. But on the left, I guess your left, the kind of fully welded sheet welded objects. We've never done such solid objects out of sheet metal before. So there was a lot of experimentation figuring out how to do this. And the kind of, once we got it all built, we had to figure out how to ship it to Columbus and minimize the number of trucks so everything fit into 2 semi-trucks. And because there was not a single piece that was actually could sit flat and you can't stack another, so we created this whole matrix of crates that hung each piece inside the crates, and then we moved the crates into the shipping container. Sorry, the trailer. And then I think after we literally fit so perfectly, there was about 6 inches left at the end to little wiggle room, And I always joke that on the right, this is when Dwayne starts to show off his welding skills, because it's like, I'm not looking. And more of our amazing team that each summer we have both people from our staff, also we have interns, and then we build these kind of really a lot of hard work building these installations. And my son who thinks he's building the installation. And some final drawings. And what was great was we spent many months building it in Los Angeles, and then we had the whole installation, shipped onto trucks. And then when we got there, we put up the entire installation in 3 days. And so this was part of the process of our team there putting it up. And just remember one of the things, if you remember those 3 canopies, and they're pretty old. So over time, they were all kind of warped, and we had to do a very thorough 3D scan of the canopy, and then match our installation to that. So actually, nothing was squared off. To the final piece. I think one of my favorite comments from the community was the fact that someone came up to us and said, this piece, while it being totally new, it felt like it was always been there. And I think that's, to us, one of the greatest compliments. So the project was supposed to be there for 3 months. And to imagining how we would cut this thing down just broke our heart, and then and then I think the community really loved the piece. This was one of the only pieces that stayed on, and the Cummins actually kept the piece on till they rented from us for another 2 years. And then I guess in midst of end of last year, they're like, okay, we need to think about moving this again because they have sort of capital plans for their plaza space, etc. So we're like, oh, what are we going to do with this? So, you know, we always hate to, you know, just cut anything down and just, you know, if we can give it a second life, sometimes even a third life, it's better. So we talked to different interest parties, and we actually convinced our the developer that we were working with in Taiwan to buy the piece. So earlier this year, this piece moved across the world to Taipei, and now we're redesigning a new cafe, sort of a art exhibition cafe space with a very special basketball court attached to it. So this is, we're currently in the permitting process. So if you can see in the last video, we took the two L's, we actually just kind of made it more square, so there was a little more interior space. And then we added this kind of right side of the project, and then added a roof. It actually becomes an interior space. And then in the back, there was an idea, and this is really an idea came from the developer who really thought it would be a great way to bring the community to this by introducing a basketball court. So they asked us to also design the court, which, you know, it's always fun to do something like this. And I think we had a lot of fun because we were working on both kind of some of the projections from the exchange piece onto the courts. We were working on certain kind of graphics related to basketball. We were working on some graphics related to the location and kind of mixing in various different scales for the project. So we're hoping, and hopefully next time, I think it's supposed to be done by May of next year. So. And then I'm going to close the lecture talking about our recent hours. So I am originally from Taiwan, although I grew up mostly in LA. And about 10 years ago, you know, my family's like, you know, we go there once a year for family kind of vacation. Why don't you just like talk to people there, see if there's maybe someone wants your building. And, you know, this is like, Mom, have you seen what we do? And then you look at, this is a landscape. And it's very much a kind of developer-driven, and where the shape and form of the buildings have really became a formula based on, like, how do you maximize square footage and in residential units. So I, you know, started like knocking on doors with different developers, and, you know, we said, oh, we have some ideas, we can do some proposals for you, and, you know, we actually did quite a few proposals. These are some of our earlier ones, and just remember, at this point, okay, the biggest project we ever done was like, you know, an installation. So for us as an office to jump scale from that to this was actually a huge jump. And so in some ways we show these earlier schemes knowing that they're not quite right, but it shows how we've grown as an office and how we work on a larger project. So like, for example, like before when we think about a line in space in an installation, in this case we kind of just scaled it up, which we understood that that's not exactly how you should work on it. But so basically, like 5 proposals later, and most of them were looking at us like, no, thank you. And so we somehow convinced one developer to give us a chance. So this is the site. And you can see a lot of the sites are like this. It's a mixture of how the city kind of grew around it, and like a mishmash of a lot of different buildings. And so what's unique about the site is that the project is on a corner. It's next to an elementary school, and it's across from a middle school, and it's next to an elevated highway. So we knew that actually this is a building that would always be viewed as an object and not as an infill, and that there will be never anything ever built around it. Which is pretty exciting that, you don't only have to care about one facade, but actually three. And in fact, so these are the schools. In fact, I actually went to that elementary school across. There was no, just by coincidence. I went to that elementary school for like 2 years before we moved to the States. And so, when we think about the kind of landscape of what we can do, maybe the kind of on the right side is what is typical, kind of all the columns on the outside, because they want to maximize interior space so they can sell more. And then this kind of cookie cutter stacked residential tower. And then the left side is, what happens to them years later when it doesn't quite fulfill their needs and people start to add on to their units. And we thought there's got to be a kind of in between where you're starting to, bring back a little bit more of your individuality, but then it still allows you to build this thing. And so we started to think about, what is possible? How do we create variations within a very, very strict floor plan condition? And what we didn't realize is how strict those conditions were. So we thought about ways, instead of just like now taking a line and blowing it up, we actually think about how do we start to break those lines into smaller scale, different layers of materials. And what you see is that, these big box columns, and they told us basically in the front of the building, you have about 5 feet because you have the 2 balconies you can work with. On the side of the building, you get about 1.5 feet. But that's all you get to design, that space within that. The floor plan is not going to change. And you have to, there's things like you can't block a lot of living rooms, you can't block certain parts of the bedrooms, you can block bathrooms, and then, so there was a series of kind of criteria that we had to figure out. And then there are also like, your panels can't angle too far in because that's bad feng shui. And then you had to, there was just so many rules that we actually never even knew about. And then at the end, somehow making it all feel integrated and it looks like it's one project. So that was really a challenge. And so we took that as a way, those parameters, and figured out how can we create these variations. And we did it through a kind of mixture of layering, and then also figuring out how to control the different positions, but not too many positions for the opening of the windows. And then designing these very elaborate, also works in both in detail and also as far away. You can start to read the kind of bigger flows that are across the facade. And I think in some ways our developer had no idea that when they brought us on, this was going to be such a journey. They actually made a full-scale, like a full unit mock-up. You can see that's me. And they even lifted it up because we didn't know like how porous the expanded metal was going to look, or how, which direction we should use. So this was a test. We also tested the Fritter glass, clear glass, and then how how they were going to actually lift these things in place. And after this, they did this. They realized like this thing is so heavy that they couldn't do the way they thought they were going to. So it was pretty. This is my favorite slide. When I go there, I have like people who hold umbrellas because it rains almost 99% of the time. So that was my. And then during construction, this building had goes 7 stories underground. So it took almost nearly like 8 months just to build the foundation, and then it kind of went up. The right side is the lobby area. Sorry, my favorite slide. And for most of the project, it looked like you only saw the scaffolding, and you get these peaks of the pieces being installed, but you really can't see anything. I still remember the day when they took the scaffolding off, and my phone was buzzing in the middle of the night because there's time difference, and people were like, I see it, I can't believe this is what it is. It was just such a revelation, and the power of the piece wasn't. It just couldn't be understood until you're really seeing it all together. Another kind of curious thing about it was that in fact, a lot of times, normally a foreign architect might, pass the drawings off at end of DD, and then they take over, and a lot of times they just kind of rationalize things, and it kind of makes it more simple. And in fact, we went straight into CA because they were terrified of making any changes because they were afraid that none of the lines would connect. And so we made every adjustment on every single one. This is the penthouse level. And in each of we were able to design some nice feature on the interior. On the left side is this kind of wall for each of the elevator lobbies. We designed this piece, which you saw earlier, for the lobby. It's been 3-4 years since the first one, and we were surprised. After the first one, the project was super successful, and everybody was so excited about it. But apparently, there was a kind of sort of financial residential bubble crash in between the end of our project, and then it took a while for the economy to bounce back. And so last year, we started working on this new project, which is on this site. And similarly, it's got, just always wanted to show the before. So the right side shows if we didn't do anything, that's what it looked like. And it's what's going to stay. So you can see that the building is already pretty maxed out on its property line. And these exterior columns are here to stay. And so, unlike the last project where everything was, a kind of at least the reading of an additive element, we were really thinking about how we can start to work on different types of modules, and how how do we wrap with something more solid? And this was in a even nicer neighborhood than the last project, so we were able to, they were considering using kind of stone and things that felt more solid. And then we were also looking at, these were some of the earlier studies where we're looking at how these, either it's additive paneling, starting to, in the left, creating this kind of white figure, or a subtractive figure in the middle, or something that's less figural on the right. I think at the end, so this you can see how the added pieces start to create some different figures on the site, on the building. And some of these earlier models where we were working on also how do you create variation within such a strict parameters of where the units and the windows are. And then in the subtractive scheme, you can really see how the kind of erasure of the piece in the center of the building on the corner start to create a larger figure. But in some ways, it's the technique is quite similar. And this last one is more of a kind of non-figural field-like, which at the end I think we kind of found a third element, and we just felt like somehow the panels didn't give another degree of let's say a more detailed connected element that we wanted in the project. So these are some of the kind of just looking at the modules and how we were starting to tweak each one and switching and what are the different module types and how do we create there were rules like I can only vary the window location 3 times per panels, and there was just a lot of same thing, feng shui, all this other rules, which we're now more of an expert on. And then we thought about a way, in some ways, like maybe it is not using the modular panels to do all of the work, but is there another element that could start to create a kind of different figure, a more finer filigree figure on the facade? So we introduced the framework, but as a way to start to inlay into the facade. And so we started to pick up different moments on the facade, like the entry. And this is an earlier where we were picking up kind of a lot of moments. And as the project starts to be more refined, we're also starting to understand, like, also where can we put this and why, where. And so we always like these gifts where you can start to see how the plan and the relationship of the plan to the skin. And you still see very much how we're struggling and how we're dealing with the corners and the columns that are relentlessly repetitive and how we camouflage and wrap them. And then there's also, like, in the dashed line is actually the property line, which is so curious that, there's moments it's literally touching the building, and some moments you guys have more space. So it also gives us a very not so consistent application of the work that we have to consider, where to put these, how thin can we do it, etc. So in the final theme, we identified and we also changed the color to a kind of black. And we like this idea of the kind of tone on tone, and the fact that we might be using something of a shinier metal with a kind of matte stone that might be also one that might be more satin, the other one might be more rough. And then these two elements, these two framed elements, and there's a third one on the other side, start to frame the entry. And then there's a vertical one in the center of the building. This one is actually a very appropriate place to put something, because that's actually the kind of ventilation shaft of the building, and it can't be totally blocked, but they really want you to not see it. And so it was a way for us to kind of creatively find a way to start to stitch, the balconies from one side to the other to the modules. So some of these, so this is also currently in the permitting stage, and what we heard is it sold quite well, and it's going to start construction next year. Actually, later this year. And then that is it. Thank you. So we're happy to answer any questions, if there are any.
Sure, Mark.
Thank you both for a great talk and for visiting and for being BarberMcMurry professors. And, thanks for everything, first of all. I was just wondering throughout the talk about the what seems to be two more or less competing forces in the work that you're showing. So on the one hand, it's intuition, or like if I can phrase it this way, like an idiosyncratic sensibility about the work, like what's a good firm and what's not a good firm seems to be very much a part of all the design that you all do. And then on the other side, like the things through which that needs to be mediated in order to become something in the world. So at a small scale, that's tooling and software and stuff like that, like how to make the thing. And then as the scale grows, it becomes kind of untenable in a way, like international developer relations, contractors, feng shui, like things that seem untenable. And yet the work, the sensibility, the intuition survives it all. So I just wonder, like the question I suppose is for you, what's the relationship between those two things, or the difficulty in navigating them, or how to maintain them in relationship with each other?
So Dwayne, you have to summarize.
You know how to answer that?
First you summarize, and then.
I don't know the answer to that, honestly.
Okay.
There was a...
For the web, he doesn't have a mic. So
the question is about to reflect on the tension between kind of intuitive, what is often an aesthetic sensibility, and the idea of a real world set of constraints and issues that you have to navigate during a project, and how that sensibility somehow survives that long process. When we were building our own projects, it was profoundly easy. It was hard work, but it was easy because we just said, we don't give a damn, about anything except the material resistance, and we're going to work to sort of put that in sync with the work that we're doing, and the cost was however much work we were willing to put into it, which was often unlimited. I think, in some ways we could say the fact that, like Jenny's pointing out, the fact that the big projects grew slowly, and we look back and are relatively happy some of them didn't get built, because we were proposing things that might not have survived that process. And I think learning along the way through the projects that didn't get built, maybe as part of the reason they survived it, is we were grappling with the idea that we might not be able to go at it with the same kind of stubbornness and insistence that we're just going to make it happen. We learned to adapt, and so when you saw her shift from those earlier total line-based towers to the other more filigree thing, which I think was also more in sync with an urban sensibility, it was just having had time to think about how that might actually work and play out. But there are also probably things that we didn't show that didn't survive, and we're still scratching our heads about how to make that work someday.
I do think, this is like a thing when I look back on, for every project we do especially in Asia, there's a story about how we convince them to do something. And a lot of times, I like to reflect on the kind of earlier work we've done. They always tell you no, like it's kind of across the board. They always say, no, we can't do that. And then you say, well, why can't you do it? And then they're like, well, we don't know how to do this. This is too hard, and then this is too expensive. And then like we pull out our arsenal of like installations, and we actually show them, this is how we did this one, and this is how we would detail that one, and this is how we do it. And we just did this in our backyard. I'm sure you can figure it out. And I feel like there's a kind of communication that you have to both like, and then do it with a smile, and then, you know, they're convinced that you can do it, and you can do it in a reasonable way. And I think there's always a lot of these projects in Asia are so like time consuming because there's so much pushback, like we can't do it. Like I remember the first day when we showed the schemes, and they told us like, we can't sell a building where every unit's different. Like this person's gonna complain their balcony is too small, and this person's balcony is too big. And we're like, wait, but then you sell them differently. You know, they're all unique, and you actually have different prices. Like that's a good thing. And I think even when we came to the second project, they completely changed their tune. They presented this project like it's, you know, a piece of art that we're giving to the city and all this stuff. And it's kind of hilarious how different it is.
So you sell it because they're all different, not because they're all the same. One of the easy answers, there's an easy way to answer that question with regard to the towers in Taipei, and that is Jenny. In a meeting is despite being, you know, nice and polite, is a force of nature in many of those meetings where, frankly, it's tough to be a woman, you know, at those conference tables of predominantly men. But she's masterful at it.
I have an umbrella holder. Anything else?
Sure.
Thank you guys for being here. It's really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the work that you were doing with the hologram software and the HoloLens. That the scale that you did that with was very much an installation scale. Have you continued to use it at a larger scale or something more at the scale of a small building, or have you considered using it and experimented with it in other typologies or scales?
Right. We haven't. So the question is about the use of Fologram and whether or not we've experimented with that at larger scales, because the thing that we showed was a relatively small piece. So Fologram was developed by a group of architects. The person who we have the most contact with is a guy named Willem Jan, who's out of Australia, brilliant guy. And he's done a huge number of projects using it and has given workshops all over the world about it. There are limitations to it that he really intelligently sort of embraces. You know, it's not a replacement for certain things. What it is a great way of sort of simultaneously working intuitively without perfect precision. Some of the limitations to it now are it will the HoloLenses tend to have a range that they work really well at. And with the second, they're now on the second version of the HoloLens, Microsoft is. They don't produce the HoloLens, Microsoft produces that, they produce the software. With the second version, it's much more precise. So you've got to assume over time, it's going to allow them to work on bigger and bigger projects. When they work on, they have worked on bigger projects. I don't know the biggest one, but you know, I'm thinking about, they have incredible videos and an extensive website. I'm thinking about things like a boat or fabricators they're working with on things like that. And essentially, the software, they will break it into chunks. So we'll work on this chunk using a certain model, and then we'll move to another, we'll sort of reset the software in order to do that. So it does do bigger things, but it takes a little bit of work, and it will take some more technology to make that happen.
Thanks a lot. I've been wondering about the ambitions of the shop drawing or the construction drawing in your office. It seemed to be more true for the installations you did, but even in the one that seems to be about assembly and construction, there's always a kind of live aspect to it, so whether it's kind of projecting shadows or whether there's a kind of graphic quality to it that seems extra or additional to the mere process at hand. I guess I'm wondering what the drive of that is, and for you, like what's the impetus to keep the practice of drawing going even when the project is presumably over?
Yeah, yeah. Part of it has been a really. The question is about the type of drawings that we're doing, particularly those that were about the installations, were more than conventional drawings. There was often something active about them. They incorporated things that weren't conventional drawing, and there's a, my sense is you're curious why we're doing that and where we hope to go with it.
Yeah.
Is that close? So a lot of that is a long time interest in. There's maybe a reaction to a couple things. Number one, the idea of the production of imagery as a drawing type has never been very interesting to us. There was a moment in time until, say, the digital, when it was especially powerful. Few people could do it, and those who could do it well actually moved architecture in profound ways. Levius being a prime example of that. When digital production and the production of imagery saturated the world, its effectiveness was killed in an incredibly short period of time. Couple that with the fact that we've always been interested in fabrication, real-world things, and as we thought about like what kind of drawings matter to us, the construction drawings did. But we have always wanted to elevate them to be sort of the status of the presentation drawing. No imagery in them, no sort of fake lines, for lack of a better word. But with all of those drawings, it's particularly in the installations, you're seeing us basically trying to make a construction drawing that operates on the level of a presentation drawing. And a presentation drawing brings with it a kind of quality, a spirit, sometimes a sense of the materiality. The details are there. You're often seeing lines being propagated that are lines that are real in the sense that they might be overhead, behind, another element projected on it, but they're not made up things. They're not imagery superimposed on the drawing.
But I think also, even in the really early days when we would do work in Asia, and when they have you can't send them a Rhino model, you can't, they can't even read it. We used to make YouTube videos. We had a whole project where we were knitting with rope, and we made a kind of how-to video, and then we sent it to China, and then we never heard from them again. And then 3 months later, we went to the project, and the thing was built. And they were well, how'd you build it? YouTube video. So I think the fact that we use, and then like Dwayne said, that last video the first video you show, those were videos we sent to our contractors on site. And when they see how seriously you take, it has very specific size of bolts, has exactly the connections. It really, they just watch those videos over and over to figure out how to do it, and then actually ends up to be very, very little questions afterwards. So it kind of serves both kind of helpful as helpful tools as well.
Yeah. One last thing: when we built them ourselves, it was a really fun time when we didn't have to create drawings for other people, but the process was elaborate enough that we had to create drawings for ourselves or our team to understand. So we always had these fun ways of doing it. Like the very first project we built out of aluminum, I, for no good reason at all, said I want to put all the information on one sheet of paper. We're going to build this whole project on one sheet of paper, one drawing. And it was just this crazy plan drawing that collected, notes, and eventually we had to change to multiple colors. But it was just this incredible palimpsest of information all on one thing. And it sort of gets you thinking in more interesting ways about how you might communicate that kind of information to other people. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how your practice, which has gone on for a long time now, and you both being educators, I think, for much of that period, has started to inform your pedagogy. I think the Taiwan buildings are interesting in the fact that architectural space is kind of compressed to the facade, right? And so I'm just curious if if those experiences have started to change the way you teach architecture.
Yeah. The question is essentially about the feedback loop between academia and the projects that we're building. In particular, the towers in Taiwan, what we're learning from them, what's going back to studio, and maybe vice versa. You want to start with that one?
Sure. We always think of ourselves like we started our practice the day we started teaching at SciArc. So, it's in some ways kind of, teaching at SciArc is already a very, amazing but also competitive thing. And so thinking about how you grow your practice under the scrutiny of, people that you really admire is not easy. But I think that's where you start to think about how you reflect on the things you do and then how you teach that. So, I always think about teaching at SciArc is that you never teach any studio the same twice exactly. And so and then if you teach the kind of same topic more than a couple times, you got to think about like, what else am I doing? Like, how am I evolving this idea? So I think just being in the part of academia has pushed us to be more reflective of our work, and then talking about the work allows us to see the larger trajectory of the work. And then so it's like every time, like this past week, Dwayne's been putting together, we didn't do talks for like a whole year and a half because we didn't like to do virtual talks. We like in-person talks. So, and then we've done a lot of work in the last year. So, retooling and thinking about a lot of the stuff we've been doing with the puzzles, how we've been teaching it in studio, and how it has also the kind of research we're doing in the office. And they kind of go back and forth. And I think that's a very productive way for us to grow.
Yeah, it's really easy to say why teaching has been productive for the practice. It's really kept us evolving. There's a pressure in academia that frankly moves too fast for an office to be able to produce it. To produce really big work, often takes 10 years, and a school's not going to put up with you doing the same thing for 10 years. So that way's obvious. The other way around is a little more complicated. I think what more than anything, it's been that doing that real work requires that, because you're out there doing it in the world, it's a little funny to go back to studio and say, I want you to do this experiment, and someone in a curious in all the right ways, student says, why does that matter? Like, what do the puzzles have to do with architecture? You don't have to have the answers to all of that. You can say it's an exploration that I think is going to build over time, and we'll mine it for more over time. But you better have a pretty good hunch about why some of it might matter. And so it's forced us to just try to have answers for the things that we're doing, because we've got some out there built in the world. And the suggestion is that we're expecting them to do the same.
I saw Steve back here have a question. Was there one up here? Okay, so yeah, that's back here.
Yeah, so with the buildings in South A, in the United States, they really didn't design like each story and each level, but they still come together very cohesively. I was just wondering how you guys managed to make that happen, and what's the process?
The question is about the on one hand variation and what we would maybe call dynamism of the facade. Very different, varies greatly, but is somehow coherent in how we think about accomplishing that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad the question was not what software do you use. 'Cause that usually happens.
I think more than anything, there was an ordering system to the way that things move up the facade. And man, it was Jenny touched on it, but it was a complicated process because on one hand, there was this sort of intuitive things are going to move up the facade in a certain way. In the end, that particular order was this constantly shifting thing. Complicated things happen in Taipei. People are promised certain units before the building is sold, and so someone wants to put their bathroom window in a different location, and suddenly the whole system has to adapt to deal with that. So the number one thing was, I think, there had to be a kind of cohesive way that things moved up the facade. But we built into the language the idea that it could branch in some other direction. So it was just from the beginning we knew, okay, things have to move up the facade in some sort of orderly way. But there is adaptability to it. Number two was probably that there was a collection of cohesive materials and formal languages that allowed for that adaptability. If we suddenly started inserting a couple of red doors into the front facade, we've got a whole other problem. So that material palette was developed somewhat early on as a way to create a cohesive expression.
Thank you.
Sure.
We'll do maybe one more.
Sure.
I think she waved it off.
We're happy to do as many as you like.
Students are going to ask about software.
She already knows. She's in our studio.
I just wanted to know, for students who are not students of yours, but who want to learn from you, what is the best way to do that?
The question is for students who are not our students but would like to learn more about how they want to know how do we do that.
Be our students.
Yeah, our student is probably the best way. People come to work in our office. We have a handful of interns every year that are paid to work over the summer. It's quite competitive for a couple reasons. One, because we teach at multiple places. It's often some students that we've known. We know we can work with them well, but that's not always the case. So. Yeah. The thing about our offices, we're surprisingly small. You look at the towers and you think, oh, there's a lot of people doing these. But we've never been more than 10 people, counting temporary people. And most of the time, we're more like 5 or 6. And people tend to stay a long time. We have very little turnover. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to... You want to go? Yeah, one more.
You just go to our website. You'll find a link, an info link there.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thank you.
And feel free to check out the work in the atrium.